everyone, to this new edition of the Indian Express Explained Live, which is our series of uh, our efforts at explanatory conversations with subject experts and authorities on specific subjects. I'm Amitabh Sinha, resident editor of the Pune edition of the Indian Express. And today we'll be discussing climate change, specifically matters relating to finance. So, climate finance related subjects, which is now the most crucial part of the conversation on climate change. It was quite evident at the COP27 meeting in Sharm el Sheikh as well, which ended last month. To talk about climate finance, we have with us Mr. Dipak Dasgupta. He's a distinguished fellow at the Energy and Resources Institute, TERI as it is known, based in New Delhi. Mr. Dipak Dasgupta has been a former principal economic advisor to the government of India, has also been a climate negotiator. He is specialized in climate finance and has been working on it for a number of years now. Our associate partner for this event is Plutus IS, and we thank Plutus IS for their association. So, the way we go ahead with this conversation, I would, broadly set up the context of this conversation with a small presentation about what happened at COP27, and then we go into the conversation straight away after that. Right. So I'll share my screen. I hope the screen is visible to all of you. Yes. So there's been a lot of talk about climate finance that all of you might be hearing or reading in the newspapers. Uh, those of you who have followed the uh, conversation at the COP27 would be able to recall that one of the biggest outcomes from COP27 meeting in Sharm el Sheikh was the creation of this loss and damage fund. And those of you who went into the details of those developments would also be aware of the fact that this was a long pending demand from the developing countries, this loss and damage fund. Also, the fact that there is no money in the fund right now, there is not even a commitment to provide money as of now, and that there is a committee which is working on operationalizing the fund. As of now, we do not know when some money would flow into it. But this was the biggest headline that came out from COP27, that a separate fund had been created for loss and damage. Now, for the sake of those who did not follow the developments or who are not fully on board and have been wondering what the issue of loss and damage is and what is this fund all about, maybe a little bit of background is in order. So, this loss and damage actually is can be looked at as the third pillar of this global response on climate change. So we have this problem of climate change. How is the world responding to it? Right. So you would have heard about mitigation and adaptation. Loss and damage sits right beside those two strategies. Right. So mitigation is about preventing or reducing the impacts of climate change. Now, of course, the preventing is no longer an option. We are well past that stage. We are not preventing the impacts. The impacts are already here, but we can probably still reduce the impacts of climate change, and that's what we seek to do through mitigation efforts. And this is about reductions in emissions, moving to low carbon technologies, doing away with dirty fuel and those kind of things. So that comes under mitigation. Adaptation is all about coping with the impacts of climate change. Now that climate change is already here, temperatures are going to rise, sea level, for example, are going to rise. So we need to prepare ourselves in a way to be able to survive in the changed environment. If the temperatures are going to be high, maybe we need to develop crops that are able to survive in higher temperatures. Uh, if our coastal areas are going to be inundated, maybe we need to shift our populations away to more safer places, or maybe we need to strengthen our coastal areas to stop erosion of our coastline. So those kind of things are covered under adaptation efforts. Uh, Loss and damage is the third pillar. Loss and damage is about recovering from the impact. So one, mitigation is about prevention or a reduction of the impacts. Adaptation is about coping with the impacts. Loss and damage would be about recovering from the impacts. Now that the no disasters are already taking place, we have been seeing with increasing frequency. We have extreme rainfall events, for example. We have heat waves. We have flooding. We have cyclones. So especially uh, you know, for the small island states, especially for the smaller countries and the relatively weaker countries, these disasters can be very costly. These cause large scale destruction, and the recovery and the reconstruction process after that is fairly expensive. So these are the countries, relatively small countries, who have been saying that they have not contributed to the problem of climate change at all, and yet they have had to suffer the worst impacts of climate change. So they have been demanding that the kind of destruction that they face every now and then, they should be compensated for that. So it is this demand, and it's been a long pending demand. It is this demand that was finally addressed at COP27 uh, through the creation of a loss and damage fund. Now, uh, the entire demand has not been met, but that's something that we will not go into right now. The important thing to be aware of as of now is that this loss and damage fund that has been created is actually an empty box right now. And loss and damage fund is actually only one of the several similar kind of funds that already exist, and they compete for money. From and these funds operate in the in the climate and environment space, and they compete for money from the donors. So. There is a special fund for adaptation. It's called the adaptation fund, for example. There is one fund for specifically for LDCs, which is the least developed countries. It's called the least developed countries fund, and there are other funds as well. So none of these funds actually have adequate money, and loss and damage is just an addition to one more fund which will be competing for money flows. So, where is the how much money is available, and where is the money coming from? So let's look at the supply side for a moment. Now, you would have heard about this $100 billion per year figure that gets reported very often. Now, this was an amount that was promised by the developed countries way back in 2009 at the Copenhagen conference, and they had said that they would be able to mobilize, was the word, that they would be able to mobilize at least $100 billion every year in climate finance from the year 2020. So they had 11 years to mobilize this fund, and they haven't been able to do so. Even in 2022, they have not been able to reach the $100 billion figure. Now, on any given year, the climate finance has not exceeded $80 billion, and that also going by the claims of the developed countries themselves. More realistic assessments actually put the figure at somewhere around 40-50 billion dollars. So that's the money that is actually flowing in every year. Also, we have to keep in mind that this $100 billion, the amount that we keep talking of, this is almost the entire international support for all kinds of finance, climate finance needs. This includes money that needs to go into mitigation efforts. This money that would be required for adaptation, for capacity building, for deployment of technology, all sorts of needs, and there are many more needs actually. And this $100 billion actually is the it caters to all these requirements right now. And if we look at the requirements on the demand side, then it is clearly in the trillions of dollars every year. And these are some of the figures that were uh, quoted in the COP27 decision text. $4 trillion every year till 2030 was needed as investments in the renewable energy sector if the global net zero goal was supposed to be met by 2050. Now that's a goal. Globally, the entire world to go has to become net zero by 2050, and for that, $4 trillion every year needs to be invested only in the renewable sector. Then about 4 to 6 trillion every year is needed for a global transformation to low carbon economy. Then about $5.6 trillion is needed till 2030, not every year, but between now and 2030. And this is required by the developing countries to achieve the climate targets that they have set for themselves. Right. So this is the scale of money that we are talking about. And of course, this is not apple to apple comparison. So this money, we are not directly comparing it with $100 billion. There are different shades of climate finance, and even in these figures actually there is a lot of overlap that happens between the requirements. But we are talking about the scale, and the fact that there is a huge gap that exists in climate finance, and the requirement is actually at least no 2 orders of magnitude higher than what is available right now. So where do we go from here? How do we bridge this gap? And for this, we actually turn to our guest this evening, Mr. Dipak Dasgupta, a distinguished fellow at Terry. Some of the figures that I just mentioned in the previous slide from the COP27 decision text actually first made an appearance in the finance chapter of the emissions gap report for 2022, which Mr. Dasgupta has co-authored. In that chapter, he also suggested some of the steps that needed to be taken at the global level to bridge this finance gap. So he is probably the best placed to answer some of our questions and also help us understand, the issue of climate finance. So we'll now get Mr. Das Gupta into the conversation. Uh, Mr. Das Gupta, so the first question, and this is something that I've been hearing about for some time, that you know that climate finance is now the most important subject in climate change. So is the lack of adequate money, do you think, is that the single biggest hurdle in enhanced climate action?
Thanks, Amitabh, and thank you for inviting me to this session conversation. And like all conversations, we discover things as we go along in the conversation itself.
Yes.
So, in regard to the question that you asked, I think I need to pull back a little
Right.
to suggest why we're talking about finance, because finance is a very dry subject. It's not something that gets us all excited
Yes.
till we either need the money or we have the money.
Right.
So the world basically, when we start, it's been developing for a while, ever since the Rio summit, maybe 30 years ago almost, when we started to focus on this question of, is there global warming happening? What is causing that global warming? And how seriously should we take global warming? And basically the question that is absolutely, and I'm part of IPCC, so as part of the scientists, we have about 1,000+ scientists working on the IPCC this year on the sixth assessment, and this is the sixth assessment. And IPCC does these every 7 years. They take this massive scientific work on what's the evidence. And what we now know for sure is several things. One is the world has been using its fossil fuels as its primary energy supply. And that is emitting the, the volume of carbon dioxide that it accumulates in the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide is not a gas that goes away. If you emit it, it stays there and it causes this warming effect to happen. So
Right.
it's like filling a bathtub with water. So as you fill up the bathtub and you get to closer and closer to the edge, global warming is inevitable and will last thousands of years. It's
Right.
not a risk that is like, let me handle the carbon emissions today and it'll go away. It's not going to go away. So the science, the physical science, one volume we do is is the report on the physical sciences just published by IPCC. Please do read it. For all students, I recommend it. For every reader, I recommend read the physical science basis. And what it says primarily is incontrovertible evidence that us humans are driving global warming.
Right.
Now, second question is, how do we know this global warming is happening? I mean, what is the evidence basis for that? Evidence basis is multiple channels by which we are measuring climate rise in global warming levels over, and we're actually able to track this link between greenhouse gases, of which carbon is the biggest source,
Right.
over thousands of years. And that's the evidence. And now in the Paris Agreement, we had signed something very important. In 2015, we had signed an agreement that the world agreed. All the governments of the world agreed, countries agreed that we would try and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and preferably keep it at 1.5 degrees Celsius maximum increase by 2100 relative to pre-industrial levels, and certainly hold it below 2 degrees centigrade. Now, these are small orders of change. If you think about it, it doesn't seem very big. I mean, we have natural variability, which is always large, but it is enormous. The damages that it's happening, we already see we are going to hit left to itself, we're almost inevitably going to cross 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming. We will exceed that by the early 2030s.
Right.
There's absolutely nothing we can do to prevent that. So we are already breaching, if you will, the fundamental sense of what we thought we would do. And so now the panic buttons are moved. And because we're going to breach that, and the panic buttons is, if we don't act as fast as possible to change the entire way that the world uses energy, and transform from a very fossil fuel dependent global economy for energy sources to one that is other technologies which are non carbon based emissions, and that renewables is a very big part of that play. But it's not just renewables, it's many other components. And so we need to move dramatically faster. So we have very limited time left within the next decade. By 2030, it's almost already less than a decade. We're running out of time. We need to cut the amount of greenhouse gas emissions by, say, roughly about 50%.
Yes.
And then in 2030 to 2050, we need to get to as close to near zero net emissions as we can.
Yeah.
50%. What does it sound like? What is this 50% inflation cut? Is basically something that is in the order. Think about the pandemic that took place. For the whole world economy came to grounded to a halt, and during that period, the decline in our greenhouse gas emissions was 6% maximum.
Yeah.
So we're going to have to repeat the pandemic effects, if you will. We'll have to repeat it cumulatively every year between now and 2030.
Yeah.
Is that a possibility? And unfortunately, I should say, fortunately, it is in the realm of feasibility. The technologies are available, the renewable spaces are available, the sources of wind and solar energy sources, these are available at costs that are moderate, and we can do it. It needs massive financing in order to do it. And so, for the first time, I think this COP27 was very critical for us because we've been shouting at the rooftops, trying to say to people that you're signing these things, and and we think we can deliver it somehow, sleight of hand, it'll happen. It isn't happening. Post the pandemic, again, emissions have shot up, and we are not in this downward curve. But for the downward curve to happen, investment is the critical need. And the investment that's happening, it is happening. Progressively, it's happening. But it is happening at a pace that it is completely inadequate relative to the scale, as you described, of where we need to be. And for the first time, we're very pleased that COP27 put it in the decision agreement for the first time. They wrote it in, they took lock, stock, and barrel. Whatever we've been saying to them, you need to recognize the problem. Humans have to recognize the first thing our problem is we need to recognize the challenge. Once we recognize the challenge, then we go into how we're going to address it. So I hope that answers a little bit. Is lack of adequate money the key question that you asked?
Yes.
It is, but surrounding that question of lack of money is actually far more fundamental. In fact, it is the way we secure our energy. It is the way we wish to live in a safe and secure world. It is risks that we are running if we don't do it. And it's ultimately a global challenge. And that's much bigger than just the quantums of finance. Finance is an instrument, but the bigger question is the objective.
Right. Thank you. Also, the way this matter of climate finance gets reported in the media, it sometimes gives the impression to the readers that developed countries have to hand over monies to developing countries, each of the developing countries probably, and some amount of money transfer has to happen between country and the government to government level. And of course, climate finance doesn't work like that. It's money flows through a very complicated web of channels. So I would like you to give our listeners, our viewers, also our readers of our newspaper, a little bit of idea on how this climate finance actually works. Who is eligible for money? Can a country ask for money? Or are individual projects within that country they are eligible for money? Who does one ask money for, and how is that? How is that application for money made? Right. Also, how much of how much money can I ask for? How much do I get? Who decides on how much money do I get? So those kind of questions, the practical bits, how does this money flow happen? How does this climate flow, which is supposed to happen from the developed countries to the developing countries, how does it take place?
Sure. So how the best way to describe it is that, as we just said, we need financing for investments that need to take place on a massive scale for the energy sources. the renewables, but you needed more than that. You need systems transitions,
Yeah.
big ticket systems transition. Our entire transport system has to go from, uh, the reliant on fossil fuel transport systems. We have to revert to electric vehicles. Think about our steel industry, our cement industry, which is we have to revert to perhaps green hydrogen. So new technologies, new systems, urban systems. We have to change the way that we go to work, come back from work, use mass transport much more efficiently, the way we design our buildings, heating and cooling. So these are massive system transformations which needs financing. And mitigation, fortunately, is something that the private sector at the end of the day does. So it is private investments in those systems, but it's also public investments where it is larger infrastructure kind of projects. So what happens in finance is the normal purveyors of finance are banks, they are stock markets, they are bond markets, and these are private sources of finances. Then, therefore, finances investments in these projects, which the private sector investors undertake, borrowing or using long term sources of financing.
Right.
Climate financing is a broader framework of how to channel more of the annual investment finance that goes on from, let's say, high carbon, high emissions kind of existing economy to a low carbon. So energy transition or a low emissions transition of economies across the world, not just developed and developing. That is the biggest challenge right now. And that money, there is no application as such that goes, it is not the business of countries to be financing this.
Right.
It is project developers
Yeah.
go to the usual sources of funding and say, so it would be, let's say, Tata Steel plant deciding that we're not going to be able to produce steel the way we used to do it.
Right.
Or it's going to be the automakers deciding we're going to stop building cars that run on fossil fuels, petroleum, diesel. That's going to stop, and we're going to use or uh, uh, battery powered electric vehicles. So these are going to be brand new factories and brand new investments taking place, and they're going to go to their normal sources of
Right.
finances. So the question is, so when that doesn't happen, for whatever reason, and we will talk about what are the reasons that stop that. So right now, for example, the world is investing about $700 billion a year. Sounds like a lot, but for the world, it's not very big. $700 billion a year, the world is investing in low carbon energy transition. Right now, that's our measured progress.
Right.
But the world is also spending about $800 billion a year, same time, on new fossil fuel investments. So
Right.
this ain't working. We are trying to go to zero, but we are spending actually more. The same bank is financing the fossil fuel, and that's going to go to zero. And you would want a transition of that financing to the climate. So climate finance is enabling that transition. It's an enabler. And think of who enables this shift in financing. Enablers are basically regulators, financial regulators.
Right.
Enablers are governments with their use of public money. So these are instruments of enabling. So regulations, central banks, governments, the financial system as a whole shifting and deciding that they're going to shift. And that is what climate finance is all about. So it's not like countries are financing it. No, there is no place you can go to and say, I need this money. No, you're still going to the same bank, except the bank is unwilling to give you the money. And we're trying to work on the edges of how to make that happen. There is one caveat. There is a caveat. And the caveat is the distinction between developed and developing countries. That's a very big caveat. See, the point is the developing countries always had this argument, we didn't cause the problem. And that's absolutely correct. The accumulation of carbon or in the air, 90% of that is because of the industrial revolution that happened, and post that, and that's not something that developing countries had anything to do with. So this argument at the beginning was about fair share. Why should you had your chance and become very rich based on using carbon? Why should developing countries not be allowed the same access to do that? And the deal was therefore on a government to government basis. That was a government to government basis. And the deal was developed countries would provide $100 billion a year, mobilizing it and using the access to normal sources of financing, but somehow acting as an enabling agent for that $100 billion. Now, where we have discovered that $100 billion goal. It was dreamt up almost. People who worked on it at that time in 2009, the person who actually dreamt up this figure, said we just pulled it out of our hat. We didn't know what the size of this was. We had to choose a number. 100 billion sounded about right. And we said, okay, that's the target. And then ever since, we've been stuck with this number. Whereas now, for the first time, COP27 has, we realized, the numbers are actually much bigger. But it shouldn't frighten us, because at the end of the day, think about how big the global financial system is. You need to understand the dimensions of this. The global financial system, stock of global money that's invested around the world in bonds, stocks, equities, other forms of it's invested. So investors have saved it and they've allocated it. It's around $300 trillion. That's the stock. And remember, this stock is roughly doesn't matter whether there's a war, there's something happens. Every year, investors earn around 5 to 7% a year on that stock. So think about this. Every year, the stock of money comes, whether it's big events shaking the world, but there is a pension funds is what generates. They have a goal. Pension funds have a goal, 5 to 7% rate of return, because that's what pays our pension funds. So they need to earn that rate of return. But they also have that choice. 5 to 7% of 300 trillion is still a very big number. So what we conclude in one of the reports that I've been working on, it says lack of finance is not the problem. There's plenty of finance going around. We spend more money on, think about what we've done with Apple or Google, the amounts of financing that's flown into the Tesla's electric vehicles, the sums in order of what we're talking about much bigger. Even cryptocurrencies, the total value of cryptocurrencies in 2 years, or real estate holdings. So lack of money is not the problem. It's the question about how do you change the system. So when you say what is climate finance, it's the complex of financing that shifts from fossil fuel financing into low carbon or lower energy emissions activities. And it's across the board, economy wide. And the developed to developing country question is, most of the emissions from now on are going to happen in the developing countries. So that's where the challenge of financing.
Yeah, surely. So just to illustrate that with an example, for example, you mentioned Tesla. Now, Tesla, if it decides to set up a manufacturing unit in India, for example, now it would be a green investment, no doubt, and maybe qualify as part of climate finance flows. But would it, for example, uh, you know, allow the developed countries, for example, to take credit uh, for moving this financial flow towards a developing country and then say, okay, this investment should be part of the $100 billion that we promised? Does that happen?
That's a matter of accounting. So think of it this way: the OECD, which is a very big think tank kind of organization based out of Paris. The OECD does this accounting. So if there is a factory that's built in India, which is an electric vehicle, zero emissions factory, let's say for argument, it actually won't be Tesla probably. It'll be probably an Indian company that should be doing it. But we'll forget that. Whoever the company is, it doesn't matter. Then they will do a little bit of accounting to see to what extent did that investment happen because of quote unquote mobilization. Was there any act or activity that took place from source country in the form of financing that enabled that? If there was, and they have very clear metrics of how to measure it, then those it's an accounting function, then yes, it would become.
Yeah.
What I'd like you to know, or like ourselves to know, very interesting, over the last 10 years in tracking this finance, 90% of the investments in low emissions investments that take place in all countries in the world actually take place from national sources,
Okay.
from domestic sources. The cross-border sources of financing are tiny, 10%. And that's the part of the challenge and part of the opportunity. So these factories are all being built by and large out of domestic resources. So we're missing something in there. How do we get the train moving?
Right. So I think you've partly answered the question that I'm going to ask you now about the finance gap. We talked about the finance gap. Uh, Now, in your assessment, how big is this gap? What is the sort of global requirement of money? What is available? Now, I realize the answer is not going to be as straightforward as I'm probably putting it to you. But still, I mean, can we get an assessment of how big the gap is, at least
Yeah,
in terms of the order of magnitude, for example?
we are actually, we approach these things quasi scientific.
Right.
So what we say is, did you sign an agreement amongst yourselves that you want to hold global warming to no more than 2 degrees centigrade
Yeah.
and preferably at 1.5 degrees centigrade?
Yes.
In order to do that, what is the scale of new investments in low carbon energy, in industry, in transport, in urban development, in rural agriculture? What is the size and scale of finances incremental that you need in order for that to happen?
Right.
And so we run these massive models, which actually have tracking of how much you need, what is the scale of transition that you need to do. And they're able to tell us with fair degree of certainty, that the levels of investment we are doing now, measured investment as best and track measured investments in, and those tracking comes from a variety of sources, it's around maybe 700 800 billion dollars a year. That's what the global world as a whole is investing right now.
Right.
And it needs to be probably in the order of maybe 5 to 7 trillion dollars. So that's a multiple.
Yeah.
By 2030. So
Yeah.
we've got a date. We know this is your investment that you need to make. And how much are you doing? You're doing around 700, 800 billion dollars. You need to be globally tally at least maybe 6 to 7 times bigger annually. Every year you need to be 6 to 7 times bigger. So fair degree of precision in the sense that, and we have it broken down by regions, by the way. So it's not just, so we have a lovely table in the IPCC, and I encourage those who want to read about it, read the finance chapter in the IPCC mitigation report and read the UNEP emissions gap report, and you'll find it, all the details stored in that story about sources and things. So huge, massive, big increase. And the numbers you cited, Amitabh, yourself at the beginning of the show, it's around those magnitudes that we're talking about. So that's the challenge.
Yeah. And what about the needs for India? I mean, there are a few numbers that have been mentioned about India as well. We need in the order of $1 trillion from now till 2030 for our energy transitions. What are the kind of requirements that India is looking at for its, for fulfilling its climate targets that it has committed to, for our adaptation needs, for our transition to net zero. What are the kind of money that we need, say, in from now till 2030, from now till 2050? How much of that can we raise on our own through our own financing or by attracting investments, and how much of it would for which we would require international support?
Sure. So let's think about mitigation investments first, and then we'll talk about adaptation investments or adaptation financing needs. Mitigation investments is all that we're talking about, which is what kind of investments do you need in the low carbon energy transition that we need to have. So for that, India has made a commitment, the nationally determined contribution, as it's NDC, as it said, that it wishes to bring down its carbon emissions quite dramatically, and it has some stated goals. Underlying that, it is also conditional on financing being available. Because if it doesn't get the financing, it's also got an energy security problem, in which case we'll have to rely on our usual coal-based or other fossil fuel-based energy. So we are on, think about the renewable space. We are committed to one of the countries that's rated very highly is India on the ambition that it has stated on its renewable space. And we are right now investing around maybe 10 to $12 billion a year on that renewable. And it's, by the way, it's very efficient to do it because the cost of the levelized energy, levelized electricity cost of doing those renewables are actually lower than many of the large coal-based plants that we used to have before coal prices shot up. And it's even better now. Where we need to be is probably in the order of 4 times those levels. Now, that level of financing is a constraint for India. And so India needs much bigger, at least 4 to 5 times the levels of financing that it is able to. Now, what choices do we have? The choices we have is if we use that additional financing, these are orders of magnitude as a share of GDP that would require India to be able to access global capital markets for those additional. You need to be able to access those global capital markets. And it can be from public or private or whatever sources that is necessary. And that won't happen given the way that the markets are behaving right now. So we need access to long-term capital markets. It can't be in the form of, most cross-border flows are very volatile. And they come in they're like portfolio investments, and they come in for 2 to 3 years. They're very shaky. They come in when things look good, and they run away when things look bad. And we're already in deep trouble. And these are magnitudes of 4 to 9% of GDP annually. So think of when we run a current account deficit above, let's say, 2% of GDP, all kinds of macroeconomic alarm signals run off. So there is clearly, intuitively, it's good for the world as a global public good that India, the third biggest emitter of carbon expected in the future, actually meets its goals. It's incredibly important for the world as a whole that India meets its goals. It's incredibly important for India that India is able to get the energy security that it needs from renewable sources. The only question is, what would it take to design an enabling environment for global capital markets to see India as a safe harbor for these low emission investments taking place? Once that world has decided, India is actually a brilliant place to be investing in. It's got all the elements. It's got the sunshine. It's got the labor force. It's got the engineering talent. It's the least cost place. If the world had to save carbon emissions, I don't know of too many places where it could save those carbon emissions by not investing in India. So India is almost like a bellwether. You're always looking for bellwethers of transformation that's possible. The risks are always there in any investment. The question is, can we design a system? So that's on mitigation. So we need to rise by about 5 to 6 times. It's incredibly hard to do. And
Right.
so sometimes you'll hear this conversation in India, "Arey, ye to kuch problem nahi hai, we will get it." No, sorry, it doesn't work that way. When you're dealing with sums this big, when you're quadrupling or quintupling the scale of investments that you're doing, you have to think about what's going to happen to your ways you're going to be managing those flows. Got to be long-term patient capital. 20-year money has to be coming in. They should not be flying in and out. There are risks. First 5 years of any investment has a lot of risks. So that's the challenges. That's on mitigation. Then on adaptation. Adaptation is going to be a huge challenge. One of our early estimates is India was already spending something like 3% of GDP. Because as the heating takes place, think about what's going to happen to the stresses on our cities. The heat stress in India's cities are going to be massive. We already know enough that in coastal areas, the wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees is the sustained. Beyond, once you have high humidity levels in coastal areas, the heat stress is going to prevent people from going to school, prevent people from working, and you'll need air conditioning, and you'll need to be able to organize our work, our school, our everything in the urban areas has to be redesigned. It's going to be costly to do that, but feasible. All of this is feasible. None of this is infeasible.
Yeah.
Same thing has to happen in the rural areas. We've got to change the way we manage the water resources. And so it's a world which is beckoning to us of possibilities and avoiding risks on adaptation. And we have to think about social security nets, which is when and those events do happen, highly vulnerable, highest risk, highest vulnerable populations need to be protected. And those protection will mean social protection instruments. And we can design it. Already our cities are starting to think about what do they do when the summer heat comes. Schools should be closing early. House rooftops should be painted white. We even have to think about massive greening of the cities. We have to think about big, Delhi, where we are right now. We can't have an urban system dependent on the car transport that we're seeing of the scale and order that we see. Drastic changes, all feasible. Do we have the it's not a resource question, it's about efficient planning questions in the case of adaptation. And then there's losses and damages. There will be flooding, massive, sudden flooding in our cities. We know this already. We've seen it in Bangalore, we've seen it in Madras, in Chennai. We are going to see massive events. We've already seen it in Mumbai. Uh, Prepare for it, plan for it. We're not going to build sea walls. That's too expensive. We can't protect it there. But we will, and also start to. So adaptation finance is also going to be a challenge, but it's of a different challenge. It's a
Right.
challenge about how we manage it, and we are perfectly capable of managing it. The question is, do we have the systems in place to do that? And it's also going to require governance issues.
Yeah.
How do we manage the different levels of government needing, interacting with each other to deliver? So that's where
Right.
we are at.
So one of the questions that we often get asked also, and concerns a lot of people like us, is how much of this financing requirements, how much of that would trickle down onto us? How much of that burden will ultimately fall on us uh, through carbon taxes, for example. Our use of fossil fuel, for example, petrol and diesel consumption can be taxed in future to raise money for climate positive activities. Similarly, uh, there can be other forms of taxes that can be imposed on us if the government wants to raise more money uh, for climate change. So how much of that burden is expected to fall on common citizens?
So don't be afraid of this. That's our main message to citizens across the world. Don't be afraid of this.
Yeah.
Here's what it takes. Uh, Basically, all that you're doing is when you're growing so fast as India is,
Yeah.
any other developing countries, your incomes are going to be also rising very rapidly. Think of
Right.
if India delivers 7% GDP growth, roughly, or thereabouts, with
Yeah.
population growth falling sharply. In 10 years, per capita incomes hopefully double.
Yeah.
So you go from two, $2,000, $3,000 per capita income to hopefully,
Yeah.
everything goes right, you get up to maybe, you know, six, $7,000 per capita income, and you
Yeah.
distribute it well so
Right.
that it's not just concentrated at the top end, and you will distribute it well if you do it right. So that's development. So that you still continue to do all that. Then what you're doing is you're borrowing today for a low carbon future from the
Yeah.
rest of the world.
Yes.
You're bringing this in from the rest of the world because otherwise you're starving your education, your health, and your other sectors, which you don't want. You want to keep those going, and you're borrowing it, and it's like borrowing money to pay for a better future. And the amounts are small enough that it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you would still need to pick up 10 years later, by 2032 or thereabouts. You'd have to pay for some of the borrowed money, the long term money that's coming in, which you borrowed from abroad. Many ways in which you can do that. One of the ways that, because it may require a lot of public investments upfront in greening the entire system, and public deficits are across the world very large,
Yeah.
they will start to think about tinkering with carbon taxes.
Right.
And carbon taxes is something that's actually, we've run many models across the world, and the common sense is don't try and push carbon taxes too high at the beginning. Don't
Yeah.
do it that way. What you do is a very gradual, smooth adjustment. And as you become more prosperous, you start to charge little higher. So defer your taxes and do the right investments now, but collect your taxes when you need to repay some of the costs.
Right.
Standard macroeconomics. And
Yeah.
and we this is absolute, no, not a problem. The issue is that you still there will be, and watch those taxes where the incidence of taxes are. You cannot be taxing, and this has defeated carbon taxes around the world, where you saw what happened in France when they started to impose tiny little taxes.
Right.
So impose small taxes, efficient taxes, play it gently, get the results, deliver the fruits of that result, and then do it. The burdens will be massive on the obverse case, and that's where the real challenge is. The, the, the burdens will be when, if we do not undertake the levels of smart investments that we need to undertake. And then you're in a position where your growth of incomes is not happening to the scale that you need. And you've got a lot of other costs that's coming on. At that point, you are in a much tighter world where you're not able to move. And therefore, it matters both for India and it matters for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And it actually matters equally that the rest of the world cares what happens here.
Yeah.
So that's my sense of the burdens. Don't be afraid. We know it's not a huge thing, but you can play it wrong. And that's a future that we want to avoid.
Yeah. So ultimately, everyone will have to contribute, even individual citizens. There's no running away from it. Uh, also, towards, and this would be our last questions before we go to our audience. Uh, Basically, the COP27 decision text talks about restructuring and reform of the international financial institutions so that more money can be directed into climate positive activities. Also, we have been talking about and we have been hearing a lot about the greening of the financial system itself, so that we are not talking about green investments, how much money is flowing into climate related activities, but the fact that all the financial activities themselves must be greened, so that uh, they are ultimately contributing to a climate positive future. So if you could just tell us what some of the things, of course you have suggested some of the ways forward in the emissions gap report as well. Now it's a sort of difficult to understand for lay people like us. But if someone can help us understand, it would be you. So, if you could tell us, in relatively simple words, on what are some of the things that are expected, both at the global level or even in the Indian context. How are the banking transactions going to change, if at all? How is someone who wants to set up a small industry, for example, in India, and approaches for a loan to a normal bank, how is that relationship or how is that transaction likely to get impacted because of the changes that are likely to come about?
Sure. So we gave it a lot of thought because this is Article 2.1c. How do you green the financial system?
Yeah.
And we were thinking we might come across a magic solution.
Right.
All of us dream that there's one missing button that was there. We just simply failed to hit that button. And what we found, there is no magic solution here. There is no one single solution. So imagine when this question came up after the Paris Agreement in 2015, people across the world were searching desperately for this magic solution. And the magic solution they turned to was this idea that all you had to do was to improve the disclosure requirements
Yeah.
for banks, for the banking and the financial system as a whole. So what you would tell the State Bank of India is, when you're making loans, make sure that you're not investing in a high carbon emissions, and make sure that much of your emissions is going into low carbon investments or financing, because you looked at the risk of what it would do for a future for India or anywhere in the world of high carbon emissions and global warming. And we thought that one system would change everything. So we had central banks and scenario running to regulatory impetus for risk disclosure.
Right.
And what we conclude is it's only one very small part of the picture.
Yeah.
Yes, it will improve. Yes, if you force corporates to disclose more about the climate risks that they're incurring. Yes, it will improve if you ask the financial institutions to improve their disclosure of information on how much climate risk they're taking by lending for fossil fuels. But these are, at the end of the day, extremely voluntary measures, and there's no way you can force financial institutions. Finance doesn't work like that. Finance actually sits at the table and watches the play of how governments and regulators are actually going to move. To the extent that they feel that governments are not convinced and are not doing enough, regulators and political instruments are not moving fast enough, finance will be very happy to do what they're doing, which is to focus on short-term profits to get that 5 to 7% return.
Right.
And they're not going to suddenly disclose all kinds of results to show that they're running these. So, yes, do it, not trigger. So there are 5 other things that you have to think about. So we think about 6 things, not one thing. You got to pump the engines on all 6 drivers. One of them is disclosure. The second is get prices right.
Right.
This is the standard. Economists love the carbon prices. Let's fix it. We should be charging high taxes for carbon users. As I had already hinted, you're going to do this much more carefully. You're going to
Right.
do it in a plateaued sense. You first generate the results that the investments are going, and think about coming in at a later stage. Think about graduated ways. You worry about equity. So carbon taxes, a limited one, but an extremely important initiative. What you can do is you can announce your intention that in 10 years' time, you're going to have carbon prices. Now, most governments are terrified of it. I mean, I don't know which party or agency would like to declare what carbon taxes. We, as
Yeah.
economists, know what carbon prices should be in 2030.
Yeah.
But I don't think any politician, we're not asking politicians to shout from the rooftop that it's going to be $100 a ton for carbon emissions. I think, it'll cause chaos around the place.
Yeah.
But there are smart ways of doing it. So the second instrument is you've got to get the carbon tax right. Third is behavioral change.
Yeah.
If we ourselves don't change our behavior as to how we go about consuming and how we go about using our and we are fond of saying that as Indians, we are extremely frugal and therefore we can't be committing too many sins.
Right.
That's probably true. I think that's true that there are many more sins that are being done by the well-heeled in the rich world than is that. But I think there's a whole lot of consumption that we do that really, I mean, India spends more every month on gold imports. And if somebody should be asking ourselves, I mean, how critical is it? How critical is it when you talk about borrowing money from the rest of the world that you have to import this much gold? Single country who does that. I mean, the crazy things that we do as a society when we think about consumption. So think about behavior change to get to a low carbon. I think we're doing well, but we can do better. Think harder about how we do it. Fourth is governments. Governments have a critical role to play to make markets happen. And we know this from past experience. When we think about what we did with public procurement of the city lighting projects, the stuff that requires public markets to work, you're creating the business of enabling R&D to happen, and that's beginning to happen. And this is helping the transformation. So governments have to play a role. Fifth is central banks. Central banks can't afford to be sitting saying, I am holier than thou. I do not do anything other than control inflation. But central banks even can't get that right very well. So they should not shy away. They've stepped in on housing finance, for example, in the US. 100 years they've been supporting housing finance. And what is it about housing finance that attracts financing, but low carbon emission transition that is such an urgency that so central banks are beginning to think about what they should do. And in fact, central banks in places like India, Bangladesh, and others are far ahead of the game. And last but not least is the question of climate clubs, as we call them,
Right.
which is that very hard to figure out an agreement that finance should flow of this magnitude from between 180, 190 countries. Sitting around a table and you're negotiating things, it's extremely hard to do that. So what we say is smaller clubs. Think about partnerships in smaller clubs. Climate clubs, much easier to negotiate with each other on the scale. G20 is a good example. G20 is a much smaller, and something like 70% of the emissions problem are in the G20 countries. And there we are thinking about instruments, which is about sovereign guarantees.
Yep.
So you need governments to be guaranteeing each other. And then suddenly private finance finds a world that is much safer to invest in long-term capital. So 6 things that you need to move on. We conclude in our report that you got to push on all 6 things working towards the same direction. So you can't be contravening each other in different angles. And that kind of turns it into the just energy transition partnerships that we're seeing. It's happened in South Africa. They've come to an agreement. It's like a 3-year program. South Africa has been promised by a couple of the big partners that they have that they'll be given concessional financing and support to with guarantees and other instruments for South Africa's transition from coal to a carbon neutral economy at 2050. Next one and these are big economies. South Africa is a very big and got big partners. Yeah. Next one that happens is with Indonesia. The announcement has come about $18 billion, again, over a smaller period of time, and similar transitions happening. India is the big question. India has always been a little reluctant, if I may use the word, because it's always afraid what is it that the rest of the world is holding out for them. Yeah. Now, at some point of time, you decide you are a big player. You don't need to take anyone. So India has a challenge of what it's going to do on the just energy transition. Climate clubs. Yeah. One way to get faster, money to move faster, and finance and investments to move faster is confidence in each other's ability. Right. Because at the end of the day, I think we also need to think about the opportunity. There are not too many investment opportunities in the rest of the world. That's better than investing in India. If I were, the pension funds called me and they asked for an assessment of what's the outlook like in India. So there's a huge wall they're waiting to come in, but they're not quite sure how they're going to do it. So That's where they are.
Right. Thank you for this very comprehensive response. Now we move on to audience questions. So I'll call out the names and they'll ask their questions. So the first one from the audience is Sonam Sahu. Sonam is a senior counselor at Plutus IAS, which is our associate partner as well. Sonam, please go ahead with your question.
Good evening, sir. I'm Sonam, Senior Counselor from Plutus IAS. My question is, are taxes the only way to mobilize adequate financial resources in the fight against climate change?
Amitabh, could you hear that better than I did?
I also missed out in between. Can you repeat your question, please, Sonam?
Yes, sir. Are taxes the only way to mobilize adequate financial resources in the fight against climate change?
Are taxes the only way to mobilize resources?
No, no, not at all, not at all, not at all. Think of uh, taxes. We as economists we think about the marginal efficiency of taxes for any given activity. You have to think about a better way is always if the markets can work towards the same end. Without taxing is relatively sometimes efficient, sometimes inefficient. So in this case, the mantra that we've always been talking about as economists is that taxes on carbon is a good idea because you're preventing it as a public uh, externality, you're taxing it. But then taxes have incidents which can be very depressing. So no, taxes are not the only instrument. There are 100 other instruments that I can suggest to you that would be as effective. And in fact, you couldn't work without those instruments.
Right. The next question is from Vinita Hariharan. She's a global policy, public policy expert at the Lee Kuan School, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at Singapore. In fact, we share the same alumni network. It's very good to see you, Vinita, here. Thank you for joining this discussion. Please go ahead and ask a question.
Thanks, Amitabh. Nice to see you here too. So I actually joined it also because of you. So anyway, not to mention that I didn't want to listen to Deepak. Of course, I wanted to listen to Dasgupta ji also. So about the climate finance part, it's so intriguing to see how this entire funding is going to play out, and we also know that there is. It's a future option in so not any time in the current or near future perhaps, but whenever it plays out, when it becomes a big system in itself, do you think we would need an external monitoring agency or like the RBI or maybe a subordinate agency to the RBI to actually monitor this entire flow of funds within the country and between countries? How is it all going to play out?
Yeah, I think there's I think you're right that when it comes to a specific country level, it helps to have an eye on the flows and volumes of flows and different sources. And we don't have that right now. In most countries, don't have it. Where the information that we are collecting is coming from a global sources, and they're coming from very disparate sources. So it would help to have a measurement annually or even semi-annual of the levels of flows and the diversity of sources that they're coming in from. But it's costly to do to set it up, but it should be done. Yeah.
Right. So the next question is from Jyotiraj Patra. Jyotiraj is a climate change and adaptation specialist at UNDP. Jyotiraj, please go ahead.
Thanks, Amitabh. Dr. Dasgupta, you highlighted the adaptation finance gap issues and clearly emphasized as governance is one of the issues to look at. So my question is, looking at the increasing adaptation finance needs for India, how can subnational governments, for example, cities and states for that matter, access some of these climate finance, particularly the adaptation finance, through existing programs or maybe the international climate finance? Thank you.
Yeah, a good question. We are struggling with this. One of the things that we think is probably the most obvious one is to set up the almost like specialized bond markets, long-term bond markets for states and green bond markets at that, for states and cities to be able to access. It will not happen without some kind of national level backing. Without that, it's not going to. The bond markets can do only so much. There is also, but it will help enormously if we are able to do that. Simultaneously, we'll have to have ways in which there would be ability to make sure that the funds that are utilized from the green bond markets for sub-national, sub-regional levels are actually used in the ways that they're supposed to be used. So it comes with those kind of caveats. You got to be careful that you have the instruments in place, but lots of cities around the world have the revenue wherewithal long term to be able to embark on the investments they need, both at the state level as well as especially at the city level, to be undertaking. Now, should they be borrowing for adaptation? That's a bigger challenge. But to the extent that adaptation has coincident needs with infrastructure, so things like which have core benefits for sustainable development and goals. So if you're building, for example, a better municipal water supply system that also has these elements of adaptation in there, absolutely you should be thinking about doing it with long-term borrowing. And where there is 100% adaptation needs for very low income marginal communities, those are bigger questions in which disaster protection and things, then we have to use public grant financing and access to such public grant financing through different instruments. And the finance, there's enough instruments that we already have that we can use under the Finance Commission, for example, for states and others to be able to use it. And then there is, of course, public insurance around the schemes. I hope that answers your question.
Right. Thank you. The next question is from Darshana Vyas. Darshana is an account director with AdFactors PR. Darshana, please go ahead.
Thank you, Amitabh. Hello, Dr. Dasgupta. So you have spoken, I have actually two questions. So you have spoken about the challenge for developing countries. So I want to know that when we talk about this, we as a country, where do we stand? As in, how much measure have we taken? Are we the country who have
Darshana,
changes coming and are we enough equipped?
Darshana, we lost you a little bit on your transmission of the question. Could you repeat slowly?
Yes, sir. So I have a question that you spoke about the challenges of developing countries. So
Right.
where would you rate India? Are we enough equipped, or where are we? How many measures have we taken? Or what is it that we have to achieve so far?
On our performance score, India is actually relative to it's been rated as one of the best performers on its ambitions, on our renewable targets, on the way we are addressing lifestyle changes. On many of these accounts, India is coming across as consistent with the global goal of limiting global warming to less than 2 degrees centigrade and preferably to 1.5. So India is there in its ambitions. The question, and it's certainly amongst the front runners, The question is, it is a conditional performance. It is, we do need the financing to be able to do it. And that's the question that India's challenge right now is. And it's a challenge for the rest of the world, whether it meets it.
So my second question is that as you've already spoken about the innovations that we need to do, you've also spoken about the challenges we as coastal countries will face. I am from Bombay and I can actually see it. Everything related to winter is there, but there is no winter. So I can actually feel the pressure. So when we say this, what are the local innovations that you would suggest or you would advise? I mean, this is also a part of behavioral change.
Yeah, I can't. I have not gone deeply into the question of the innovation system in India to be able to frankly answer you. But what I think I can say is that India is relying a lot on startup, the world or the ecosystem of startups being able to kind of handle this innovation. And that's useful. But I think where we are missing is the national innovation strategy. Now, I don't know enough about that to be able to conclusively say, are we well short? What we spend on R&D as a ratio of GDP at a very aggregate level is about 1% of GDP. Uh, Given our per capita incomes, that's probably okay. But if we had ambitions to be going much faster, then it's probably closer to doubling or tripling the amount public money that goes into innovation, public and private. We're not. I think we are not spending enough on innovation funds.
Right. The next question would be from Renuka Gaikwad. She's the founding member of Change Foundation. Renuka, please go ahead.
Yeah, good evening, Amitabh ji and Dipak ji. My question is, what kind of policy level changes are we expecting in near future to access the climate finance or about the climate financing? Thank you.
Thanks, Renuka. I think you're asking a difficult question. I tell you, from our science point of view, what we do is we try to tell the story as faithfully as we can. That what we know and what we see is what we. So the urgency and the need for public policy action is stated as clearly as possible to all 180 plus countries that are participants in the climate process. And so the question that you ask is, what policy steps are going to come next in order to meet that? I think one very big goal is the 2025 stock take. There's a stock take of going to happen. And based on that stock take, there's going to be some decisions made about how much finance should be increased and from what sources. I'm hopeful that the pressures that we are becoming transparent will help on that. I think this idea that you have smaller partnerships in which finance flows is also critical. I think that we can expect that the financial system will respond much more ambitiously if governments also signal, together with central banks, much more clearly on what the risks ahead are and how to avoid them. So those three things are the three steps that we're looking forward to. And sometimes we believe in this S curve of transitions, which is that initially it looks very difficult, but once you cross that little hub, suddenly you can see an escalating. And that's how technologies around the world have happened. It follows this very difficult initial phase. And I think we are stuck in this initial phase. Once we're able to successfully conclude, and basically the game theory on the economic theory side, where we come out is you need a few large players to be crossing the bridge. And once those things happen, and if you're asking me, are those very large players willing to cooperate to do those things? Your guess is as good as mine.
Right. Then the next question is from Nitin Ganorkar. Nitin is a research officer at Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai. Nitin, please go ahead. Nitin, are you there?
Nitin, can you please unmute yourself? Okay, I think we can come back, sir. Maybe he's having some problem.
Okay. Okay. So we move on to Mayur Jebhe. Mayur is a professor at Indira Institute of Management, Pune. Mayur, please ask your question.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you for giving me an opportunity to ask question. So Dipak ji, my question is that so post industrial revolution, we harm our planet Earth a lot. So is it sufficient that the fund which we are going to raise from this loss and damage fund? So is it sufficient? And why we are not pushing domestically or Indian government? Why we are not trying like a CSR? CSR fund is there, right? So we can add one more fund, CGR, corporate green fund or responsibility, 1% from the industrial stakeholders. So we can use that fund to curb carbon emission and all those things. So is it possible?
Yes, Mayur, for India, we have one degree of freedom that many other countries don't have. When you're a very large country, you can actually self-insure yourself against loss and damage to some extent, which is that that when, for example, there are big national, weather disasters or linked to climate change disasters taking place in some parts, it doesn't happen all at the same time all across India. Then it is possible for the rest of India, in a sense, to be providing the support to the part that is most affected. Think of the rains in Kerala that happened. Huge, and whether it is climate related or not, I don't have the information to be able to say that we can verify that it was climate change related. But assuming for a moment that is the case, then it is possible that there will be enough funding for emergency relief to take place and deal with the consequences of those disasters, coming disasters that may happen in our cities, coming disasters that may happen in our rural areas. So, provided it is not so widespread, we should be able to self insure ourselves and take care of it through the funds that we build, emergency disaster management funds. One thing that the emergency disaster management funds don't do is true loss and damage. True loss and damage is where you have to cross and rebuild. And rebuilding is much more expensive. Think about, the infrastructure that is damaged, that has to be rebuilt. Think about the housing stock redesign that's going to happen. So that only in the case of India, again, the size helps. So we have insurance mechanisms, private insurance mechanisms, which can help. We have public-private mechanisms in which we can rebuild at a much lower cost. So all in all, to say you're correct, India's approach to loss and damage, because we're a large country, should probably be okay for the next 10 years. We don't necessarily need a whole lot of financing from the rest of the world. Except there is always a proviso. If there is runaway problems happening on the global climate change, and the scale of the global warming that happens over the next 10 years and to 30 years is unchecked, and that means that the global public problem of global warming becomes much faster, then I don't know whether we have enough. And that's really what brings me to adaptation changes that we need to think about right now, which is what is happening to heat stress in our cities, what happens to the water stress in our agriculture, what happens to the management of social safety nets. But it's something that we should be able to manage, not that we need the rest of the world to be helping us out.
Right. The last question for this session will come from Mansi Chaudhary. Mansi is a Mahatma Gandhi National Fellow. Mansi, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, very good afternoon. Good evening, sir. Myself, Mansi. So, first of all, thank you very much for this enlightenment. I mean, I just got to know, I'm very new to the subject of climate financing. So, in a very in a language, I just want to ask that how will climate finance have an impact on the money supply of the country? Like looking at the current scenario, how will it impact the money supply? And don't you think that it will have a huge impact? I mean, by giving so much importance to climate finance, we are somehow diverting from other issues which are of more importance to the citizens which are belonging to the rural India. Because I'm working with the rural citizens of my district. So how it will have an impact on the rural citizens? Thank you.
Mansi, your questions are absolutely on track. Sometimes we think ourselves, are we overplaying this climate thing? But let me answer it this way. Couple of things. One is that the trade-offs between doing the right things on climate versus doing the right things on development. There are some trade-offs, but the trade-offs are far smaller, and the positivities, which is the gains from each other, are far bigger. So that's a relief, because so if we build the water supply systems better in rural areas for adaptation to be able to deal with the droughts that are going to happen or excess rainfall, we know how to conserve the water better using natural ecosystems to our advantages. Those are actually 100% in consistent with sustainable development goals challenges that we have. So there's enough of this synergy of climate, doing the right things on climate and doing the right things on development. No problems at all. I'm more worried about the other things, which is the things that we don't do on sustainable development that ends up being the worst outcomes for the most marginal and the most poor. They're the ones at greatest risk. So when you say, I want you to stand with us, and we wish to stand with you, that climate is actually absolutely consistent with goals on rural development, nothing that takes away. But it is also the case when you ask the larger macroeconomic question. If you spend so much on climate, will you kind of increase the money supply? And money supply is, of course, a code word for money gets diverted into things and projects that we have no control over. And that's a disaster. And that's a national problem that every country has to figure out. We have to figure out how we are public citizens and we do the public things that need to be done. If we can't do this 75 years after independence, I don't know whether climate is the problem. I think it's something else. So, yes, we are terrified about the things you mentioned, Mansi, but we hope for the best.
Right. Thank you. I think we'll have to bring an end to this session. It's been more than 1.5 hours since we began. So thank you, Dr. Dasgupta. Thank you very much for all the very informative answers to all our questions. We also thank our partners, Plutus IS, for their support throughout. And thank you, all of you who joined and for this, this session. Some of your questions have remained unanswered. Unfortunately, we couldn't take all of them. In fact, I can see more than 50 questions that have remained unanswered. Some of them I'll probably direct to Mr. Dasgupta at a later point of time. But thank you for joining. It was a very informative session, and I hope it was useful to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Amitabh, and thank you for inviting us.
Plutus
Plutus IS is introducing new batches for UPSC CSE 23-24. Our features are live interactive classes, small batch size, well qualified and experienced faculties, doubt removal sessions, current affair classes, study material and test series, mentorship programs, mock interview sessions. To know more, contact us at 844-844-0231 or visit our website www.plutusis.com. Plutus IS is introducing new batches for UPSC